special welcome to all of you on this cold evening, and some hoped to be frequent guests and an already frequent guest. Nicole has been commissioned by Soundstreams in the past. In fact, the commission before this was an homage to John Cage that was for so percussion and turntables. And Nicole wrote that and went on to win the Jules Lizée Prize for Chamber Music in Canada for that. So we're very pleased to have Nicole back. A special welcome to our two guests, who are two of six members of the Australian Art Orchestra. And let's put it this way, this all started, at least for me and for Soundstreams, over lunch with Paul in Melbourne, I guess a little more than 3 years ago. I wonder if perhaps we could start with you to give us a little bit of a sense of, since you were there at the beginning, what made you do it, Paul?
I assume you mean the work passion that we're to hear tonight. Well, thank you, Lawrence, and it's really wonderful to be here in Toronto for a whole host of reasons, but not the least of which is the fact that, yes, indeed, we did have a conversation some years ago, and you know, in this business you have many conversations with many well-meaning people, and they often lead nowhere in particular except into a kind of mist of good intentions. But here we are, so I must thank you now publicly for making it happen. The Australian Art Orchestra was founded in 1994, and it was founded, partly in response to the fact that I have a very sincere belief that the word contemporary music, or the term contemporary music, is a far broader thing than its applied usage in various different categories of music making. By which I mean contemporary music, where we come from in Australia, can be applied to popular music. Popular music in funding structures is often referred to as contemporary music because it's not art music. And I'm not taking a view on that particular dichotomy yet, but I have one. And the other usage of contemporary music, of course, normally refers to fully notated music, or music in which improvisation plays a very minimal or subsidiary role. And I happen to come from a background originally as a classical musician and then as a jazz musician, and I believe very strongly in the power of the improviser or the improvisational moment as being central to a musician's ability to express themselves. So I wanted to do something which restored the role of the improviser into the mainstream of contemporary music discourse, where I felt it was being given short shrift. There was still a sense that the improviser was a kind of a lesser being. And I don't subscribe to that view because in the 21st century we are revisiting a paradigm in music which was very much alive and well in all higher musical activity until well into the 19th century, and that is improvisation. Many of the great composers who are canonical composers were great improvisers, and their music was not the fixed entity that we imagined that it might be if we only regarded the printed score as the last arbiter of the information that these people sought to communicate. It's well known, of course, that Bach was a great improviser, but it's also well known that on Bach's scores there's, apart from the actual pictures, very little information about what you're supposed to do with them, apart from, you know, rhythm and register. But, you know, he's light on in terms of phrasing and dynamics. Mozart, we know that, you know, very often when he performed his piano concerti, the ink was still dry on the pages. He would literally hire a band to play the piano concerti, turn up, and he knew, of course, as the composer, what was happening with the music. But the first performances of a lot of Mozart's work would have been largely, particularly from his point of view, improvised. So it wasn't until the printed scores became available, the published music, that the so-called urtext became, this highly valued artifact that we now associate with the work as a completed thought. And I think the art orchestra arose out of the need to understand that music is a continuum. It is an ephemeral thing, and it's in the very nature of its ephemeralness, or its ephemerality, that we come closest to understanding it. The art orchestra grew out of that idea, and in taking on Bach's Matthew Passion, we've been at the same time cheeky, but extremely respectful. This is in every way an homage to Bach, who we regard as one of our ancestors as an improviser, and of course our collective ancestor as one of the greatest arbiters of the human experience, the way to communicate the essence of being human outside of his own time and space.
There you have it. Peter, perhaps in carrying on from what Paul has left us with, thank you, Paul, the term post-jazz has actually, I don't know if this is fair, been attributed to either you singly or together or to the AAO. Also, of course...
I did read that in the program, but I don't think that actually we did...
That's mine.
Is it?
It's Paul's, yeah. You
Post-jazz.
see?
Wow.
You have to come to Toronto to find these things out. But also the term genrelessness, which is a term that we have heard here, but I'm sure it has some relevance to you. And I wonder if you could just comment a little bit. Paul has started us thinking about, of course, the relationship between the past and the present, and so many things we think are so new are not so new after all. But some things truly are new, and perhaps those terminologies refer to that.
Yeah, I'm tempted to think that there's very little that's actually truly new, and that most creative expression builds on some kind of a precedent. But I think what is new is, what's always new is a genuine personal perspective on what's gone before. So if you can succeed in creating some form of expression that is, and I hesitate to use the word authentic because it's such a tricky word, but for want of a better one, authentic, then I think people respond to it, and in turn can be inspired to create their own response, their own version of newness that is particular to their experience, and that's what I think I'm always striving for. And when I listen to the recording of Passion After St. Matthew, and to be honest, when I came into the job of artistic director, I hadn't listened to that music for a long time, and I was well aware of it, and I've followed the art orchestra's progress right through my own career. But coming back to it and really having a good listen, I think it's quite an incredible achievement, especially going back 18 years ago when these kinds of crossovers between classical and, well, in this case, Baroque music and jazz and improvisation were far less common. And it doesn't sound like jazzed up Bach, which I think is great. It does have its own mode of expression. It doesn't sound like a pastiche of influences, and I think that's a remarkable achievement for Paul and for Nico, who's sitting up there, who's one of the founding members of the art orchestra, and also one of the composers on the program tonight. It's an incredible achievement, so I'm very happy to be a part of it.
Mm. And Nicole, maybe you could comment a little bit. I'm in the habit when we're going to commission composers, I like the sort of the middle of the night phone call when the composer's just a little too sleepy to really know what they're getting into. And then later on they realize what they've committed to. But anyway, I had this intuition that somehow this combination of old and new and improvisation and post-jazz, somehow it just felt like it might be the right thing for you. And I know when I first contacted you, you were in the middle of doing an awful lot, and I sent you also a link to the recording of the AAO's St. Matthew Passion. Maybe you could tell us now what you really thought.
It's in a letter I have mailed.
To be opened 40 years after.
Yeah. At least until I'm out of Toronto tomorrow. This sort of project feels very natural. It's something, it's where I've come from. I grew up from a very young age surrounded by a variety of musical styles that mean a lot to me. So yes, and eventually became notated because it's very much for me a form of expression or a form of communication to sort of, I find there's a challenge in writing for instruments that are not normally written for. Something like turntables, something like a stylophone, like a reel-to-reel, so that it can coexist in situations and contexts where it's just not normally found. You wouldn't see, you never saw like a reel-to-reel being performed in the context of an orchestra or turntables in an orchestra. And so this sort of setting seems very natural, where there are elements of improvisation and notation and the electronica, using vintage instruments sort of melded together and creating something vital, essentially, out of that, something meaningful in the now, which speaks to me ultimately.
And when we originally spoke, there was a kind of creative ambiguity about where this piece would eventually fit, because we knew that parts or most of the original Passion after St. Matthew was going to be done here. And so it was I'm just wondering how you dealt with it. And I know how we finally dealt with it, but should it be a part of what was being done, or was it, in a sense, was it another movement, or was it a standalone work? And I'm just wondering if that evolved as you wrote it.
It did, it definitely did. And I opted to sort of, I just sort of went with the standalone work in a sense that I wanted to write a piece that was definitely inspired by Passion, but not necessarily by specific moments where it could be sort of interspersed within the work. Something that definitely, which speaks to me anyway, speaking about the title of the work, the pareidolia, the messages, things like that, canons and hockets, but again, canons and hockets that are sort of broken and
Baroque that's broken.
Baroque, yes.
Broken Baroque.
Yes, yeah. But parts of them are erased, or parts of them are mutating and superimposed over each other. Something like that, which is sort of what I've been working with in any case in my music. Sort of break things, again, mutating, going into a different direction, being filtered, again, to represent what's happening today, for me personally.
Mm-hmm. I wonder also if I certainly found it interesting to hear a little bit more about, you have another project coming down the line, down the pipe, that has a connection to Beethoven. I wonder if you might just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we have a project called Jumping Yaks, which is an homage to Beethoven via his Seventh Symphony. And those of you who are lovers of that music will know that the Seventh Symphony of Beethoven, which was premiered in 1813. Actually, probably written in 1813, premiered in 1814, was, it's been described by some people as the apotheosis of the dance. It's a highly rhythmic piece, and like so much of Beethoven's work, it kind of propels itself across time through a progressive intensity of rhythmic activity. It's for me, Beethoven is the composer who never ages. I'm always amazed by his ability to understand the relationship between sound and silence, which at the end of the day is what making music is all about. It's a similar kind of project to Passion in the sense that 4 composers have been asked to respond to the 4 movements of the symphony. And we are yet to perform this work. It's the 4 pieces have recently been completed, and we look forward to workshopping those pieces soon. But as with all these types of projects, it's and Passion, the one that people will hear tonight. For me, as I was saying before, a work is never finished in the sense that, there's only one version of it. Coming from an improvised music kind of legacy, we are very much of the mind that the recordings of improvised music, which are the way that we document our work, just that, they are recordings, they are ways of marking, milestones along a road. And I'm sure that the Beethoven project, like this one, will go through many iterations, none of which will be considered to be the definitive version.
Just before we take questions, just one last brief question. Perhaps each of you could, Peter and Nicole, could respond. Bach in a way, occupies such a unique position because we hear him in the elevator, let alone somehow there's something about, not that it's necessarily good to hear his music in an elevator, especially the way it's often done, but the point is that there's something about the structure, something about the melody, something about what he did that lends itself to reimagining. And I'm just wondering what is that? What is it about his music that makes it so attractive to do what you've done and what you're doing tonight?
I don't know if it's easy to answer that question. It's definitely got something to do with symmetry. There's something incredibly satisfying about the structure, something satisfying about, when things happen, It's that simple thing of listening and the right thing happens at just the right time. But melody is endlessly mysterious and interesting to me, anyway. And I kind of often think about Wayne Shorter as well, the great jazz saxophonist and composer, who wrote a lot of very, very short kind of melodies, miniatures, as vehicles for improvisations, which have the most distilled melodic sense and the most fascinating structure of bass and melody and counterpoint, which is coming from Bach. And I think those threads, those inspirations that he expressed just keep on echoing through music, don't they?
And what about you, Nicole? I mean, would it have been the same if I'd asked you to do something around Vivaldi?
Yeah, that would have been much different. With Bach, I mean, from a very young age, I was fascinated just by looking at the scores. It's the symmetry and the contour and the shapes and the geometry that I found fascinating from a very young age. There's something about just looking at a score of Bach and seeing, there's so much detail, there's so much going on there. So I was really drawn for a long time to just the appearance of the score, and then what it sounds like is pretty intriguing.